Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. If there is one genre that I've been able to establish that many of you love on here, it is the classic arcade style beat 'em up. We have looked at countless games from this medium on the channel over the years, including of course the legendary Streets of Rage series, a franchise that in 2020 finally got its long awaited 4th official series entry, becoming the highlight of a mostly terrible year. 2020 may have sucked, but at least many of us had time at home to play beat 'em ups, eh? Since old school Sega fans had to wait 26 years for Streets of Rage 4, this would lead to some imaginative fan-made projects that would try to plug that massive Streets of Rage gap in our lives, many of which we have examined on this channel in the past. Today it is time to look at yet another marvellous example of a fan-made game that would further build on Koshiro and Company's iconic original work. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Streets of Rage 2X, a game that some believe delivers the most refined Streets of Rage experience yet. Yeah! Streets of Rage, Streets of Rage, Streets of Rage, one of the Sega Mega Drive's most well-known IPs. The title's legacy by this point is unquestionable, with the games becoming must-own key titles within gamers' collections during the 16-bit era. While the first game in the series did an amazing job of bringing two-player cooperative arcade-like street brawling into the living room, the second game in the series, Streets of Rage 2, arguably went one step further, delivering a beat-em-up that arguably looked and played even better than most beat-em-ups that could be found in arcades at the time. This was in part due to taking gameplay influence from the recently released Street Fighter 2, which featured large character sprite work and more diverse movesets than what had ever been seen in video games before. Basically, in addition to standard attacks, characters could now perform unique blitz attacks by double tapping a direction before attacking. Further to this, special attacks were made possible that could deal extra damage, and players could now attack enemies from all directions at the cost of the player's health. This was made possible via Streets of Rage 2 appearing on the first 16 Meg game cartridges to see release on the Mega Drive outside of Japan. This meant a much bigger and more impressive game being made possible. If you can recall living through the 1990s and noughties, you will be able to remember the speed of which technology would move on and how games would constantly change in scope, as evidenced between the huge graphical differences between the first two Streets of Rage games. The retrospective downside to all of this is that new computer technology would evolve at such a pace that it felt like many gaming genres as a whole were beginning to be lost to time, with 3D polygonal model-based gaming replacing 2D sprite-based games within this brave new world. This meant as great as games like Streets of Rage 2 were, by just a few years later, as soon as the latter portion of the 90s arrived, it would be seen as a relic of the past by most, no matter how refined an overall gameplay experience it actually delivered. The 2D beat-em-up seemed well and truly dead. As discussed on this channel before, this did not stop staunch fans of the genre channeling their love of these sort of games in other ways down the line. For example, an internet user by the name of Kratos began hacking some Sega Mega Drive ROMs for friends to play around 2011. His first dive into such a pursuit would revolve around one of his and many others' all-time favourite games, Streets of Rage 2. Using Streets of Rage 2, he would create experimental ROM hacks, playing with the game in a way that he had never experienced before. This would, for example, include replacing the well-known characters from the game with the likes of heroes from Final Fight and Street Fighter. A fitting tribute really, considering that Final Fight was the main gaming influence behind the first Streets of Rage game, and Street Fighter 2 was one of the main influences behind the second. As fun as this was, and what a useful learning curve this had all become, the ROM hacker would soon become frustrated with the hobby's limitations, so would choose to stop hacking altogether. Fast forward again to 2016 and he would discover the fantastic Open Bore, the royalty-free, sprite-based side-scrolling gaming engine that we have covered in videos a lot on here in the past. After learning to use the versatile and easy to use program and mastering all of the basics, the former hobby hacker would, by his own words, decide to attempt to use open board to its max potential. This would eventually result in the creation of Streets of Rage 2X, a reimagining of the already brilliant Streets of Rage 2, in an effort to make it even better and bring it into the 21st century. The fan game developer would use his website known as F-Games to upload regular blogs covering the creation of his title, and on December 27th, 2017, would report that although his game was not 100% tested yet, it was now ready to play for all. Streets of Rage 2X would be presented as Streets of Rage 2, but with significant improvements added to the traditionally established formula. So let's discuss what was new here in order to try and bring this classic game up another notch. For starters, whereas the original Streets of Rage 2 would only offer up to 2-player cooperative gameplay, 2X on the other hand would up co-op play to allow 4 players to enjoy this game simultaneously, much like the likes of Turtles in Time and many other classic arcade beat-em-ups from the Streets of Rage 2 period. Further from this, the combat system included in this game would be drastically changed to what could be found within the original. For example, a new air combo system would be introduced that allowed for juggle controls, and hit and max hit counters were also added to the experience. Building on this even more, new Rage special skills were brought to the table. Special and guard bars were also added, as well as the ability for players to block attacks and even perform guard breaks on opponents. Essentially, it seems that while the original Streets of Rage 2 would take influence from Street Fighter 2, Streets of Rage 2X on the other hand would draw from many fighting games that were not even released yet as of 1992. Thus meaning that fighting mechanics wise, the man behind F-Games had many more sources to draw from than the Streets of Rage 2 team had back in the day. This was not all though, as enemies spawning randomly would be introduced, as well as the placement of dropped items. To match the more complex combat system that this game implements, enemy AI and skill levels would also be improved in order to match the player's new abilities, although many argue that this has resulted in a much tougher gaming experience. Regular enemies along with bosses from the game would also be made playable, and new graphical effects would be implemented to further refine play. Perhaps one of the coolest changes of all to the game though was of course the fact that all of this could be experienced in 16:9 as opposed to 4:3, making Streets of Rage 2X a perfect title to enjoy on modern monitors, and that is even without taking into account that the expanded playfield meant that 4 playable characters can fit on the screen more easily. F-Games would reiterate though that this game would be constantly updated and improved upon, with bugs being corrected and new content being dished out as time progressed, and that all bugs and glitches with the game should be directly reported back to him. Of course, this would lead to the F-Games page being updated regularly, documenting all of the fixes and improvements to the game that were being rolled out, resulting in more and more refinement for this title as time would press on. By the time version 1.3 of the game was ready, for example, running sprites were added like in Streets of Rage 2, aerial recovery moves were added to combat, along with rage moves being performable while holding weapons, with each character being given their own unique weapons-based attack. Changes are fairly extensive by this point, with sound and graphical effects being improved, with enemies and bosses' level of aggression also being made more balanced. This project continued to become something rather special. Between November of 2018 and May 2019, there had been a space of 7 months which would not see the game receive any new updates. However, that May, Kratos would announce via one of his F-Game blogs that it was now time to explain what was next for this game. On this day, it would be confirmed that a new extra menu was to be included so that gamers could further customise their Streets of Rage 2X experience, and a level select would be made available to all of those skilled enough to beat the game. Further from this, Rebellion mode was to be implemented, a feature that allowed for all enemies to become playable in a separate game mode. Perhaps the biggest announcement though was that new routes were being added to the game, so that players could now play Streets of Rage 3 stages mixed into Streets of Rage 2, thus making this game now far larger than just the ultimate version of the franchise's second entry. To build on these ideas, Streets of Rage 3 characters would be added to the mix, along with a new alternative ending to the classic Streets of Rage 2 story. 2019 was looking rather exciting for this fan experience. Throughout the year, more and more light would be shed on these up and coming changes, with F-Games in November revealing to the world a new type of bike stage, one of which is inspired by a screenshot of cut assets from the Streets of Rage series from back in the day. This reimagining of the lost media would allow players to control the bike's speed with the engine sound reflecting the two-wheeled vehicle's velocity. All the new features I've just mentioned, as well as many more refinements, were included in the release of version 1.7 of the game that would arrive in December 2019. Not only that though, but F Games would announce their intention to add Streets of Rage 1 content to the game next, with plans of making this one of the most refined Streets of Rage tributes in history. In February of 2020, F Games would proudly show off some images within their blog that someone had produced a custom arcade machine specifically to play their game, stating that even they never imagined that the Streets of Rage 2X project would come along this far. The cabinet by RGS Arcades is certainly an interesting sight to behold. Throughout 2020, refinement and countless small changes would continue to be made to the game, but it would be August of that year that the next big news on this open board game would surface. In this month, the website would finally show off footage of the Streets of Rage 1 content that was being produced for the game, which would also include the long-awaited introduction of Zan as a playable fighter from the Streets of Rage 3 game. A cancel system and wall balancing mechanic would also be announced. As usual, the blog will continue to trickle out more info on changes, including the release of version 2.0 of the game, which was created ready to receive the Streets of Rage 1 update, and later a special Game Gear route would be added that contained the original Predator-like character. By this point, many more internet users were also helping assist in the creation of this game, including testers and even some providing extra assets for the game. Speaking of these people, a creator who goes by the name of Kimono produced a new Ringmaster character, for example. F Games credits this person as a very talented spriter, and that this character was totally remade for the game. Prior to this, the Ringmaster was a boss exclusive to the Master System version of Streets of Rage 1, who looked like an old man in a Ringmaster attire carrying a large cannon on his back. The fact that he wears a top hat, in my opinion, makes this the most stylish character from the Streets of Rage universe. Over the course of this year, more and more will be shown off in relation to the Streets of Rage 1 content that is going to be added to the game. However, in September of 2021, it was announced that the title's current 2.31 version of the game is going to be the last that carries the Streets of Rage 2X title. As obviously, over the course of years, this project has morphed into far more than just an attempt at making a more refined version of Streets of Rage 2. As you will all be aware, the game is set to compile the entire original Streets of Rage trilogy into just one game, with elements from the Master System and Game Gear conversions also being thrown into the mix as well. And that is without mentioning the influence that has been taken from Streets of Rage original assets that were left behind on the cutting room floor. With the current direction for this fan project, F Games have recently announced a new name for this up-and-coming compilation project, Streets of Rage X, which I am sure we shall cover in depth on this channel in the not too distant future. Many internet users out there already prefer Streets of Rage 2X to another amazing Streets of Rage fan project known as Streets of Rage Remake. But with all of this currently unfolding, is Streets of Rage X going to turn out to be the greatest Streets of Rage fan experience of them all? I'll leave that for you to make predictions about yourself in the comment section. It certainly cannot be argued that Streets of Rage X is an ambitious up-and-coming open board game, and that Streets of Rage 2X offers one of the most refined Streets of Rage fan projects in existence, and in my opinion deserves more credit than what it currently receives. Sure, there are lots of gameplay videos out there showing off this project, but as far as I can tell at least, this is the first standalone video published online explaining what Streets of Rage 2X actually is. So personally, I think this game deserves a little bit more publicity and attention, as a lot has been achieved with this title through the love, care and attention to detail that has been put in place with regards to the creation of the game. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was a breakdown of the history of Streets of Rage 2X and exactly what it is. A game many consider the most refined Streets of Rage fan experience that has been made yet. Speaking of this fan-made project, I would be curious to hear what you think of this game down in the comments below, and how you personally feel this game measures up to the originals along with other fan-created games. Feel free to bring your own perspective to the table. If you are new here, I have plenty of Streets of Rage content for you to check out, including a movie-length episode covering the entire history of the franchise. So why not subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and give it a watch now. Videos like this are in part made possible due to the fact that I have the time to work on the YouTube platform full time, which is made easier thanks to my generous Patreon backers. So as usual, thank yous go out to Sebastian Velez, A Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Heo, Paulo Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Corey Imarsh Sr., Capcom vs SNK, Ryan Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Mampf, Azra Orakai, Jopkin Varela, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Angel Light 85, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Johnny Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Hermes Gonzalez, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Michael Hall, Wesley Sang-hee, Drew Peacock, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Vlaming Renee, Marvin O'Liga, TLG Driver, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Dan Van Dammit, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bowell, Chris Fisk, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Retroverse.com, Casey Wright, Synth Spaces, Punk Toast, Gunther Hendricks, and everybody else who backs what I do. In the words of Elvis Presley, thank you very much. Yeah.